All right, insider report. We're just a few days away from Georgia kicking their season off in Atlanta. A noon kickoff against the Clemson Tigers. Dabo, Swinney. We got a chance to get a little bit of an insider report for you. I'm going to throw it on the screen right now, so y'all are making sure to go check out Dog Post. Look, it's been a busy week getting ready for the season, and Kirby was all over him again over the weekend. Keep in mind that Georgia did not practice this past Sunday or Monday. That's not abnormal. This is completely how this works this time of the season. They treat this week as an off week, but he was definitely very vocal, and that was he was very vocal at practice over the weekend. And quote, he was all over them was one of the quotes in this report. So make sure you're checking that out. The link is down below. One of the things in here talking about Kalen DeBoer, Nick Saban. I was talking to somebody who has pretty good knowledge of this situation and said that Saban had thought of everything. Now it's up to Kalen DeBoer to take all of that and execute. He said, look at, and someone else different in college football had this to say to me. He said, look at Kalen DeBoer's overall record. He doesn't lose. He's embracing everything, checks all the boxes. I think they're going to be good, talking about Alabama, but I don't think they'll be what they were. I don't see them being what they were under Nick Saban, who could. They might be more like Ole Miss, scoring a lot of points. Certainly, a lot of discussion of Kalen DeBoer and what Alabama's going to look like. We won't really know what Alabama looks like until they play a legitimate game. That's going to take a little bit of time. They got Wisconsin here coming up soon. Obviously, Georgia soon thereafter. But with this Clemson Georgia game, there's a lot of negativity on the Clemson side of things. There's a malaise of sorts, and there's a few reasons why. First of all, you know when you talk about the peak Clemson era was 2015 until the end of really 2019. 2020, they lost in the semifinals, kind of got blown out by Ohio State. They didn't play great that year. There were times when they were just not great. But you can throw that season in there if you want to. But it's not at all like that. From certainly the Georgia game in Charlotte on, these two programs have gone in opposite directions. Georgia's won 2 national championships. Clemson's not gotten into the playoff. Georgia, they both have only won one conference championship, but those are not created equally. That's for sure. But really, the biggest thing, you've seen a lot of transition at both places, but it's really hurt Clemson in a way that it's not Georgia. You've seen Georgia roll through a new offensive coordinator since they won the national championship last. New defensive coordinator since they won the last national championship last. But that's not true. Glenn Schumann was then. But my point is, there's been transition. You have a new starting quarterback. I mean, DJ Uiagalelei obviously is just not a good quarterback. I think that's clear. But that's not gotten a lot better in terms of production for Clemson right now with Cole Clubnik. Jeez. And there's just a malaise right now at Clemson. The fans are negative. You're seeing that in secondary ticket prices. This game has plummeted, and from what it could be or should be. I remember the way the Charlotte was, and it's different too. I mean, we're not talking about 2 national championship contenders. No one right now thinks that Clemson is a championship contender for the national championship. For the ACC, perhaps, but I'll tell you, this was a bad weekend for the ACC. I mean, it was a good weekend for Georgia Tech. Don't get me wrong, but watching a team that is supposed to threaten to get into the play, or supposed to be in the playoffs, just get manhandled like that, and then I watched SMU. SMU's in the ACC now. That was bad against Nevada. They looked horrible. So it was just not a good thing. But back with Clubnik, there were 3 games that Clemson won last year where he didn't throw for over 131 yards. And that was against Wake Forest, South Carolina, and Notre Dame. Like, that's not going to work with Georgia. If you're throwing for fewer than 131 yards against Georgia, I guess like an Auburn situation, that's not what Clemson is. I mean, that's not who they are. And the other troubling part about those games specifically, and they won those games, but 2 of those 3 games that Clemson won, they scored 20 points or fewer. They scored, I think it was 17 in one game, and against South Carolina, they may have scored 16. Like, scored 17 or something like that against Wake, and they scored 16 against Carolina. They scored 31 against Notre Dame. But he threw as many interceptions as he did touchdowns in those games. And on top of that, in the losses to Florida State, Miami, NC State, and Duke, those are the games, where he threw as many interceptions as touchdowns. He was sacked 12 times in 4 games. That's 3 sacks a game. You're only going to get about, best case scenario with the way the clock is now, let's just say the best case scenario is where you get 12 drives. You can't just flush down a quarter of your drives because you got sacked. There's going to be times where you don't move the ball. You can throw interceptions. It's just far too many sacks. They beat Kentucky, but he was sacked 8 times against Kentucky. Now, let me just say this about that situation. That's not always the offensive line at Clemson's fault. Sometimes it's Clubnik's fault because he just doesn't, and this is talked about in the report. I would encourage you to click on it. We've got a deal where you sign up today, you're going to get the website for $1 until the Alabama game. So make sure you're taking advantage of that offer while you can. But there's a lot of negativity. I think with Georgia, I was talking with someone last night. It's very quiet in Athens right now. There are some things we actually don't know about Georgia coming into even the Clemson game. There are things that we don't know going into that game. We'll learn a lot during the game. But, is Smile Monday going to play? Is Trevor Etienne going to play? There's a lot of stuff that we don't know yet. My suspicion is they both will. I can't report that. I don't know. I will say this for like the 4th time. I don't know. It's up to the program to do what they want to do. But the program and the coach are well within their right to not play a player if they want to, if they felt like they broke team rules or something like that. But in terms of suspending him for UGA policy, well, he wasn't. The charges that he would actually be suspended for the DUI, those were dropped. So I think if you're, you can't really argue that he should be suspended because it's UGA policy. If it's a team policy or if it's Kirby's policy, we don't see the team policy, that's different. But, Marcus Rosenzweig Saint was suspended for the first game of this past season in 23, if I'm not mistaken. But that was if I recall, that was sort of a habitual situation. This has not been a habitual situation with ETN, but we'll just see. This line is jumping between 13 and 14, so 13.5, which is what we've been talking about the whole time, is where it's at. But one thing that, if you read the report, that you'll get a little bit better insight onto is the place where Clemson really feels like they can compete with Georgia. There's 2 spots, but I'm not going to focus too much on their wide receivers. They do think they're better at wide receiver. And these are, for people with background, I know a lot about Clemson and South Carolina just from going to school, going to college in the state, keeping up with the people my age now, and there's coaches and so forth. So there's a lot of people that I know in those communities. Namely, and she doesn't have any insight, but my wife. I can report the malaise amongst the Clemson folks on my in-law side of things for sure. But there is an optimism at receiver and their defensive front. Barrett Carter is one of the best players in college football. When North Gwinnett, Georgia recruited him, didn't sign him. It's going to be a really good player. He's a really good player for Clemson now. He's an exceptional player. Came back. This is his final season. He's got a chance to be arguably the best linebacker in the country. So, Smile Monday is in that category too. So you've got that. But, there's one Barrett Carter. There are a lot of linebackers at Georgia. CJ, where did he get a hold of Williams, the freshman? This guy is something else. Okay, Justin Williams. So you got Munden, Walker, C.J. Allen. There is no shortage of linebackers at Georgia. They are very good. But that's where the spot is, the Georgia offensive line versus the Clemson defensive line. If you see in the first half that Georgia's effectively moving the ball, it's going to be running it. It's going to be a long day for Clemson if that's what happens. Clemson's going to have to hang in there and compete. They're going to have to hope that Georgia makes mistakes. JT Daniels made a mistake and gifted Clemson 3 points in 21. It's got to be stuff like that. Not that DJ didn't gift Georgia a ball and scored a touchdown, but Georgia was more effective than Clemson was that night. Neither of them were great. Let's just be clear offensively, but Georgia was more effective. Clemson literally could not run the ball. They had negative 2 yards rushing, if my recollection is correct. So it's going to have to be sort of like that. Now, in that game, what you had, and this can happen, you had a season-ending injury on the second play of the game. So if you get into a situation for Georgia on their offensive line, so they had to immediately shuffle. Now, Georgia ended up with 121 yards total on the ground. They had 2 Clemson. That was it. Clemson had 180 yards total. Like, that's not acceptable at all. And so, Georgia only wound up with 256. So it was just one of those games. But the worry at Clemson, I would say, in a big way, is the quarterback. They do not trust him. They're worried about him. And unlike the Orange Bowl from a year ago, the 22 Orange Bowl, whatever year it was 22 season. He had won the conference against North Carolina and then gone to the Orange Bowl, and they got beat pretty bad by Tennessee. They were very explosive. That's what I would be worried about if I were Clemson. Is when you look at what Georgia's got on the offensive side of the ball, they are explosive. Clemson is not explosive, not like that. They used to be explosive, and that's the part where the negativity, all of that really comes into where they're at. I mean, I was just looking at this. I mean, Clemson only gained 50 yards rushing against Georgia. They lost 48, which is insane as well. They gave up. Now, that was a really good Georgia defense, no question. They Georgia sacked DJ 7 times. So they never could get going offensively. I remember watching, on the side. It was the first game after COVID. It was like the COVID was kind of failing away, kind of going away. We'd gone through 20. This was the first season without COVID, if you want to call it that. And I remember watching Dabo just imploring his guys, just like, come on. And they just were not good enough. And I don't know that they are markedly better today. They play well at home. They play pretty well at Clemson. Away from home, it's a different ballgame for them. They have had a harder time lately on the road. The game at Duke a season ago, Matt DeBerry said, "Hey, that they can lose that game," and he was right. I did not think they could. I did not think they would lose. Excuse me, but they did, and it was just really a troubling. That was bad, and then they didn't play great, and then they should have beat Florida State and they lost it. They lose to Miami on the road. That was just horrific. That loss. When you look at the loss to NC State, they just kind of got beat, I think, in that game. But then when they got back to Clemson, they beat Notre Dame, which I thought they could. They drilled Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech did not play well that day. And then North Carolina was of no real consequence to them. So they beat them by 9 and then kind of slopped around at Williams-Brice. An ugly game. Ugly. 23 total points scored. And then they go in the Gator Bowl and they score 38. Against a good Kentucky team, physically speaking, but that game became a just straight-up shootout in the second half. That game was nuts. But they're very Jekyll and Hyde, and the best team they beat a season ago was Notre Dame. But they left a win on the table against the Noles, and they're hard to trust. Is kind of where I'm at with it right now. Georgia's not. I mean, they're very easy to trust. They, if they're playing Alabama, it's going to be a fight until the fourth quarter. Everybody else, it's just kind of like, they're just going to beat them, and they do. And I don't know. I think when you read the report, I've also got some stuff in here about Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Clemson. But mainly the big thing to watch, I think, and I'll talk about this more later in the week. It's just as simple as watching the lines. So this is Clemson and Georgia here. It's essentially an SEC game, okay? Who's winning up front is who's going to win the game. You watch the Tech Florida State game. Georgia Tech whipped their ass. That's just, I mean, like, there's no like explanation other than that. They just beat them. Period. And Florida State was not ready for Tech's physicality. Think about that. It's amazing. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video.